Hello and welcome to the Apologetics315 podcast with your hosts Brian Oughton and Chad Gross. Join us for conversations and interviews on the topics of apologetics, evangelism, and the Christian worldview.
Forget MIT or Stanford now. They wouldn't touch us with a 10-meter cattle prod.
Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Apologetics315 podcast. I am here with the one and only Brian Oughton.
Welcome back from Christmas. And that was Chad doing the intro today. And just trying something different. I think we'll stick with the formula.
Wow.
Right. Today we've got Jonathan McClatchy with us. He's a Christian writer, international speaker, a debater. He's the assistant professor at Sattler College, Boston, and fellow of the Discovery Institute. He holds a bachelor's degree in forensic biology, a master's degree in evolutionary biology, a second master's degree in medical and molecular bioscience, and a PhD in evolutionary biology. So he doesn't know what he's talking about, so we thought we'd have him on.
Right.
He's got a great new resource. Now, I'd recommend he's got plenty of debates and things all worth watching. So I want to recommend his website, jonathanmcclatchy.com. So we'll link to that in the show notes. Go there and you can find plenty of great resources, his blog, his writings, debates, any other audio resources, and some video interviews and such. We're going to be talking to Jonathan today about a great new resource that he's spearheading called talkaboutdoubts.com. We're going to get into that more in the interview, but really looking forward to this one.
I'm looking forward to this. I've followed Jonathan's work for years now and featured some of it on Truth Bomb. And I'm very much looking forward to actually getting to chat with him. And this new resource looks really interesting. And I think it's great, especially with the trends of deconstructing faith that kind of on social media of people sharing about how they've walked away from their faith and going through this process of deconstruction. I think this resource is great for people that might be struggling with doubts and struggles. And it's a great place for them to go and ask questions to top-notch thinkers and scholars and YouTubers. And so, yeah, I think it's a great resource. I would also like to say in my defense, I would like another shot at doing the intro to the podcast. I mean, that was my first time just getting my feet wet.
I sprung it on you 10 seconds before you did it.
Right. So I would at some point like another shot. I think I could do it. I think I could do a really cool, like, hey, welcome, everybody. You know, we can really make it fun. You know,
let's go to the interview.
Let's get ready. Switch me on.
All right, Jonathan, welcome back to the podcast. How are you? How are you keeping these days?
I'm very well, thank you. I live in Boston. It's been a while since I've been on this show. I was on Apologetics315 back in the day, I think over a decade ago, discussing, I think it was intelligent design at the time. So yeah, I'm now living in Boston. I work as an assistant professor of biology at a Christian college called Sattler College that's now in its fourth year of operations, a brand new college, just recently accredited. And just continuing to do my apologetics.
Yeah, well, if there's a top 5 people I would point people to, like any question you've got, apologetics-wise, anything, who would you point them to? Like, well, Jonathan McClatchy, he's got you covered.
Right.
You could pretty much answer it all. And, wearing a hat today, and it says facts. And so it's sad that we're not doing video as well because great thumbnail.
Right.
The last time we met was in Belfast. I think we played some chess or something. And
I remember you showed me around the Titanic exhibition in Belfast, which was a real blast. I'm a great Titanic fan. So I'm fascinated with the history of the Titanic. So I really enjoyed being shown around the Titanic exhibition there in Belfast.
Oh, I didn't realize you guys had actually met. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Excellent.
He's the other person who defeated me blindfolded playing chess.
Oh, wow.
So that's 0 for 2 for me.
I didn't realize you'd been defeated twice by blindfolded people.
Who was the other player?
Tim McGrew's daughter.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
So
he says bitterly.
To be fair, I did have one arm tied behind my back. So
wait a minute.
She's won the Michigan State Women's Championship at least once, maybe multiple times.
Well,
Wow.
You could say I helped her get there in a sense.
You,
I was just one more step on the ladder. Well, Jonathan, we're super excited about this cool resource that I've only just found out about and is recently launched. Talkaboutdoubts.com. Tell us a little bit about what the idea is behind this website. I can figure it out by looking, but I want to hear how it started and how you gathered all these scholars and stuff together to create this sort of resource.
Sure. So since about 2016, I have been doing one-on-one Zoom calls with Christians who are wrestling with intellectual doubts concerning the veracity of the Christian faith. And I've been doing so through my personal website. And basically, I've received about 1 or 2 requests a week on average through my personal website to have a call over Zoom discussing people's doubts with them. And I talk to a lot of people that are considering leaving Christianity or people that already have left Christianity. And we sit down and we discuss together their intellectual concerns about the truth of Christianity. And I also help people to develop a protocol for working through doubts in an intellectually responsible and methodical way. And more recently, this year, I have thought that it would be nice to be able to reach more people, because I've watched hundreds, if not thousands, of deconversion stories on YouTube. And I also lurk in some Facebook groups where people are giving their deconversion stories. And I find that the vast majority of people that deconvert from Christianity, in my experience from watching those videos and watching posts on social media, it's from a place of being not very well informed about the evidence or about epistemology and how to think about evidence and arguments and so forth, and often for irrational reasons. And so I really have a passion for being able to intervene in people's lives before they deconvert, because once they've already deconverted, it takes a lot more effort to win their attention and get them to come back.
Sure.
Actually, at least one person I know through this ministry has reconverted to Christianity, having been an atheist for 2 or 3 years.
Wow, praise the Lord.
But it is much harder to bring someone back than it is to help them to not leave. So recently I launched this website, talkaboutdoubts.com, where I have assembled a team. Currently we have about 30 team members of scholars in relevant fields. Some of whom are top of the field in their subjects, who are willing to sit down and have one-on-one Zoom calls with Christians who are wrestling with intellectual doubts. So basically the way it works is there's a forum on the website, and people that have doubts about Christianity are invited to fill out the form, submit it. That comes to my inbox, and then I decide which of the experts I think would be most suited to addressing that question. And that's based on area of expertise, and different experts are willing to do different frequencies. So some people are able to take requests once a week, other people once a month, and so forth. And so based on frequency and expertise, that helps me determine who best to send that particular request to. And then the scholar, if they're willing to take on that particular request, will directly contact the inquirer and set up a one-on-one meeting with them via Zoom to discuss their doubts in confidence. And some of these, for me at least, turn into long-term mentoring relationships, where I will perhaps agree to mentor someone over the course of months, maybe once every couple of weeks, doing a Zoom call and discussing how it's going for them intellectually with regards to their investigation of the evidence for Christianity. So that's basically my heart in this ministry and why I decided to launch it.
So it's like you're Nick Fury and you decide which Avenger you have to send out on a mission, essentially, is what I'm hearing. So that you've already touched on a number of things we wanted to talk to you about, and particularly deconversion is one of the things. But before that, in thinking about your team, you've assembled quite a team, and looking at the website, and not to elevate anybody above anybody else, but could you kind of tell us a little bit about what that process was of assembling the team, and then maybe share a few people that are on the team just for listeners in case they're interested?
Sure. So I have reached out to most of the scholars that are on the team, or from me reaching out to them and asking, hey, this is the resource I'm trying to create. Would you have any interest in being a part of this? And I give the scholar free rein on how frequently they want to receive requests, what topics they feel comfortable dealing with. And I've been impressed by the number of scholars, most of whom hold faculty positions at universities, who have been willing to dedicate some time out of their busy schedule for this ministry, because they recognize the value of this sort of endeavor. And some people that are on the team also are there because they actually reached out to me and asked if they could be on the team. Now, I'm very selective in who I have on the team, but if someone requests to be on the team, I offer them an interview, usually over Zoom, and we talk about their areas of expertise and get to know them a little bit. And so the website, as I said, is talkaboutdoubts.com, and there's a list of the people that are on the team currently. And we have some well-known names like Dr. Timothy McGrew, who is a professor of philosophy at Western Michigan University, one of the brightest people I know. And actually, even before this new ministry, he often has been joining me for these calls with people that are doubting their faith.
Wow. And
he's a really great resource and very generous with his time and making himself available for calls and such. So I very much appreciated having him on board. Dr. Stephen Meyer is also on the team. He's the director of the Discovery Institute. Dr. Justin Bass, who's a New Testament scholar. Dr. David Galloway, who's a medical physician. He is also the president of the UK Centre for Intelligent Design. Dr. Max Baker-Heitch is a philosophy PhD. He has been very much involved with the Oxford Centre for Christian Apologetics, teaches philosophy at Oxford. We've got Wesley Huff, who's a PhD candidate in New Testament at the University of Toronto. Dr. Luke Barnes, who is an astrophysicist based in Sydney, Australia, and he is regarded by many as, along with Robin Collins, as being the leading expert on the fine-tuning argument for the existence of God. We also have a couple of women. I've been trying to get more women on the team, but so far we've got two, which are Lisa Quintana, who has an MA in apologetics, and Dr. Julie Reese, who teaches. She's a professor of psychology at Goshen College in Indiana. So there's just a few of the names that are listed on the site, and the team is continuing to grow, and hopefully will also increase in uptake as well as we move into the new year. We've had quite a lot of uptake already as well.
Yeah, it's quite an ensemble for sure. On the website, it says, "Are you a Christian who is seriously struggling with doubts?" And one of the things that occurred to me when I read that is that there are some within Christendom that would actually claim or at least suggest that doubting is a sin. And I was just wondering how you would respond to someone who made that claim.
Yeah, I don't think that doubting is a sin. In fact, we're encouraged in Scripture to question whether prophets are really from God or not. For example, in the Old Testament, you read Deuteronomy 18, where the people of Israel are given by Moses a test by which they can assess and evaluate whether someone who claims to be a prophet is truly speaking from God or not. And that test, of course, is the consistency with which they forecast the future. And so the people of Israel are encouraged to be skeptical and to doubt prophets to see whether they are from God before they believe. We're encouraged in 1 Thessalonians 5:21 to test everything and hold fast to the good. Proverbs 14, verse 15 says that simple man believes everything, but the prudent gives thought to his steps. We read in Matthew 11, John the Baptist sends disciples from prison to say to Jesus, "Are you the one we've been expecting, or shall we wait for another?" And Jesus doesn't say to John, "No, you've just got to have faith on this. You shouldn't be doubting." Rather, he says, "Well, go back to John, tell him what you see and hear. The blind receive their sight, the lame walk, the lepers are cleansed," and so forth. And so it's so Jesus, of course, presents them with evidence. And in Acts 17, when Paul is preaching in Athens, he says that God has set a day when he will judge the world by the man he's appointed. He has given assurance of this to all by raising him from the dead. And actually, the word there that's used for assurance is the accusative form of the Greek word pistis, which is the word that we translate faith. And so, in other words, he's given faith of this to all men by raising him from the dead. And so that is therefore a form of evidence, because God doesn't expect us to take it on blind faith, but rather he's given us evidence, a public testimony to Jesus' messianic and divine identity through his resurrection from the dead.
Wow. That's probably the best concise answer I've ever heard to that question. Thank you. That was encouraging.
Well, thanks for that, Jonathan. I'm curious, as you've watched various deconversion stories and that sort of thing, and then you've done a lot of coaching calls or not coaching calls, you've done a lot of these Zoom calls where you talk to people about their doubts. Two-part question here. Do there seem to be a common thread of doubts that you come into contact with? And then do doubts tend to be more on the emotional side or the factual side, so to speak?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I'll deal with the first one first, which is what recurring themes do we get for these requests? And probably the most frequent issue that I encounter is the problem of divine hiddenness, which is does God not make himself more immediately available, more immediately apparent in the world? Why does God conceal himself? And there are different ways that argument or objection can be parsed out. Sometimes people say, why does God require us to go and get PhDs in astrophysics and molecular biology to uncover his existence, right? Why can't he make it more obvious? And one of the things I say to that is that God is not hidden because the evidence of design in nature is pressed up against our noses every time we go and look at nature. When we look at the way that living organisms, for example, are designed. And Richard Dawkins, as you know, said that Darwin made it possible to be an intellectually fulfilled atheist. And what he means by that is that prior to Darwin in 1859, when he published The Origin of Species, there was a widespread belief in God, because and biology was considered to be the leading evidence that God exists, right? You've heard of Paley's watchmaker analogy, for example. And it's thought widely among evolutionary biologists that Darwin essentially explained away that strong appearance of design by invoking this mechanism of natural selection, which could account for the illusion of design without recourse to an actual designer. Now, if Darwin got it wrong, as I maintain that he did, and the natural selection and chance variation doesn't actually explain the appearance of design in biology, then we're actually back to where we were before Darwin. And actually, the problem, the illusion of design, or the problem that presents those that would deny that, has been strongly exacerbated even since Darwin's time because of the modern advances in molecular biology. We now understand the information content of the cell and the molecular machinery in the cell. And so the appearance of design is much, much stronger than it was even at Darwin's times. And so it's not so much that God is hidden. It's not so much that it's difficult in determining that there is a creator. Rather, it's been made artificially more difficult than it ought to be by bad scholarship. One doesn't need to, in order for one to be rational in subscribing to a conclusion, one doesn't need to first become confused by a bad argument and then unconfused again by the solution to that bad argument. So I would argue that actually God has given us rational justification to believe in him as creator through the natural world. And that, of course, should, I think, propel us to investigate the world's holy books. And I view this life as a probation, and that probation can take different forms. So, for instance, someone in Boston, like myself, might involve many weekends spent at the library studying books that show us evidence of God and of the truth of Christianity. For someone, for instance, in Afghanistan or Iran, that might take the form of Isa appearing to someone in a dream and indicating his existence. So that's the problem of divine hiddenness is probably one other point I'll make there, and this also relates, of course, to the issue of emotional doubt, which you mentioned. Because emotional doubt is often tied to the argument from divine hiddenness. And there is a high proportion of people that contact us who experience more emotional doubt than intellectual doubt, although often the two are connected, and often they're connected to this issue of divine hiddenness. People feel that, okay, it's one thing to talk about events 2,000 years ago, right? Jesus rising from the dead 2,000 years ago. But what about now, right? What is God doing in the world today? And why is there no tangible experience of God in my life? And one of the things I say to that is that one ought to be careful not to limit the scope of one's inquiry to one's own experience, because we know that God works differently in different people's experience. And I would argue that we actually have sufficient testimonial evidence for God's work in the world today through even miraculous healings. And Craig Keener has, as you know, a 2-volume set on miracles. And he documents example after example of well-documented miracles, which are often multiply attested and sometimes with medical documentation. And these are not things that like someone got a headache and if they prayed and it went away or something that
Right.
had gotten better anyway, but rather people that were blind from birth and being healed after they were prayed upon or prayed over. There's also examples in that book where someone is preaching in a foreign land and they don't know the language and they're heard in the native language of the hearers when they're preaching the gospel. And these are within Dr. Keener's circle of acquaintances and contacts, and even family members. So it seems unlikely to me that they're all lying to him, and these are people that he trusts. And the fact that they're multiply and independently attested also helps. And I've also heard similar stories along those lines from Dr. Michael Brown as well. So I would argue that even if you don't have immediate tangible experience of God, of the presence of God in your own life, one should not limit the scope of one's inquiry to one's own immediate experience, because we have sufficient testimonial evidence from others that God is indeed at work in the world today. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah, very much so.
Now, I have a follow-up question about, let's say someone calls you up and says, hey, Jonathan, want to talk to somebody about some doubts. Here's the sorts of doubts I'm having. What is that, in your experience, the people you've spoken with, what does that look like? And is dealing with doubt as simple as presenting facts, or is it, is there something that you would say recommend them to read, or, how does that call look? What does that call look like?
So it varies from person to person. Some people suffer from OCD and they get so hung up on very trivial issues, and like you help them resolve one issue and then they're on to the next one. And like I do try to help people develop a protocol for working through doubts in an intellectually responsible way. So, for example, one thing I encourage people to do is to learn to distinguish between questions and objections, right? A question is not the same thing as an objection. A question may express an objection, but to become an objection, a question needs an additional premise, either that we do know the answer and that this entails some sort of internal inconsistency or is at odds with empirical data, or we don't know the answer, and if Christianity were true, we should expect to know the answer. So, for instance, recently I had someone contact me who one of his issues that he raised in his initial email was, well, what happens to those that have never heard the gospel, right? Are they damned? And I said to him, well, let's suppose, for the sake of argument, that we don't know the answer. That's the worst case scenario. Okay, there's just a question we don't know the answer to, right? It's hardly an objection. Right. So it's okay not to have the answers to all questions. Everyone has unanswered questions, but that's not the same thing as an objection where you've got an additional premise that shows that this actually reduces the plausibility of Christianity, because obviously there are certain things that are not disclosed to us, and that's okay. We don't know the answers to everything, and we don't need to. I think that the one common issue in people's deconversion journeys is the need for cognitive closure. And the need for cognitive closure is a need that many people have to have all questions and objections answered satisfactorily before they can be content in their worldview. I think that the degree to which you're tolerant of not having cognitive closure, I think that will correlate with tendency to remain in your otherwise well-supported belief, if that makes sense. Because there's a Richard Whately, who is a Christian philosopher who lived in the 1800s, said he talked about the so-called fallacy of objections, which is that and this is a very, very common issue, where people get so fixated on objections that they don't know the answers to, that they miss the forest for the trees and miss this avalanche of data, which actually tends to confirm their view. Because all scientific theories have anomalous data, because we're not omniscient, right? There's always information that we're not privy to, that we just don't know. And so there's always data that appears to conflict with our theory. But you don't just abandon the whole theory because there's some data that looks a bit odd from the vantage point of your theory. Rather, it's okay in science to invoke ad hoc auxiliary explanations of those data points. Now, of course, if you continue putting stuff on that shelf, then the shelf's going to break. But there is a certain level of one can afford a certain level of tolerance of anomalous data in scientific theories and in, I think, religious propositions. And the level to which you can be tolerant of that, of course, will correlate with the amount of evidence that you have supporting that particular perspective. And so one common misconception is that evidence is something which is binary. Either it completely justifies a conclusion or it completely doesn't. And I think that's a very simplistic and naive concept of evidence. So for instance, I think that the problem of evil is some evidence against theism. That's okay. I think there's evidence on both sides of the balance. In fact, I often caution people to be wary of anyone that tells you that all of the evidence is on their side, because then they're probably very susceptible to confirmation bias. Because for any complex issue, there's always evidence on both sides of the balance. Now, one issue there with the problem of evil is that it's often overlooked is the problem of epistemic dependence. Because these are not epistemically independent, the instances of evil that we have in the world. And there's a problem of diminishing returns by multiplying examples. But by this, I mean that you can't just keep adding examples of apparently gratuitous suffering in the world indefinitely and expect the argument to continue increasing in strength. Because if God has a morally sufficient justification for permitting one instance of evil in the world, you may have a similar morally sufficient justification for permitting the second and the third and the fourth and so forth. And so you can't just keep adding examples and expect the case to continue to multiply in strength. Whereas when it comes to the evidence for theism and Christianity more particularly, we have not just all evidence of the same kind, but we have extensive evidence that spans multiple disciplines. So we have evidence of different kinds, which are epistemically independent. Another issue with the problem of evil, by the way, is the problem of evidential entanglement, because you cannot have suffering and you cannot have evil without having conscious objective experience. And conscious objective experience is, as Richard Swinburne has argued in his book, The Existence of God, the existence of consciousness is much better predicted on theism than it is on atheism. And therefore, the problem of evil and suffering is very improbable on theism and atheism, which are two mutually exhaustive propositions. So does that help?
Oh, yeah. I think that's real helpful. And I like the idea of a protocol and just say, let's work through this, systematically. I want to shift a little bit. I want to branch off a little bit from this idea of emotional doubt and talk about maybe experiences people have gone through. For instance, some of our listeners, I know I've listened to a podcast called The Rise and Fall of Mars Hill, where a lot of people go through a negative church experience, betrayed or hurt by leadership and that sort of thing. And so this begins hurt, and it can start a process of doubt. I went through some negative church experiences where that's what got me into apologetics, was like, well, who can I trust? Why should I trust the Bible? That sort of a thing. And so thankfully, I got answers and it bolstered my faith again, but it was that experience or negative experience or a church getting burned by the church, so to speak, that pushed me into that. So I'm wondering if you're seeing that at all in the people you're encountering, or is it maybe a combination? Sometimes I think people are hearing things from the culture or from science or something, and it's causing them to doubt, or, as you say, the hiddenness of God, like, where's God? I'm just wondering what proportion of that might be just out of curiosity based on just negative experiences within the church.
That's certainly very common. And one of the things I say when that comes up is that if Christianity is true, it strongly predicts that you'll find hypocrites and people that profess to be Christians that are not in fact Christians. And so the fact that you find hypocrites cannot be evidence against Christianity, because Christianity predicts that you'll find such hypocrites. That's one thing I would say there. And the more common issue I think that comes up, though, is not so much moral hypocrisy, but rather shallow thinking and anti-intellectualism that exists within the church. That's much more common in my experience of talking to people. Just the other week, or last week, I think it was, I had a call with someone this came up for. They were really frustrated with just the anti-intellectualism that they encountered in their church. And I said, well, welcome to our world, right? Because
unfortunately.
Yeah, exactly. This is a real problem. It's also a problem in the atheist community, by the way, as well.
That's a great point.
So becoming an atheist isn't going to solve that problem, I'm afraid, because there's a lot of anti-intellectualism in atheism. I mean, just look, for example, at how large some of the YouTube channels become that are just really anti-intellectual, like Matt Dillahunty, for example, or the atheist community of Austin. Aaron Ra is another good example. So they have their anti-intellectuals just as Christians have ours, and it's sad, but it's just unfortunately the reality we live in, and that's why we need ministries like talkaboutdoubts.com and Apologetics315 to try to educate people about the evidence for Christianity and the need to be rational in our beliefs.
Well put. One of the things that caught my eye, I love the idea of this ministry because there are these deconversion stories. I mean, you talked about that, how you said you watched so many of them, right? It's just kind of all the rage right now. But another thing that the website highlights is this idea of reaching out to the sincere seeker. And one of the things that got me thinking about is there are people who are sincerely seeking. They're struggling. They want answers. They desire answers. They've struggled with these questions. And unfortunately, many times the church hasn't given them the answers, right? But then there are those people who really are just seeking to argue, right? They have no intention of following Christ, and they're kind of dug in, if you will. And this happens not only, I'm sure, in your ministry, but also just kind of on the street at our jobs and stuff. How is it that you discern between kind of that idea of somebody that really is sincerely seeking versus somebody who really, they just want an argument?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I, as I said earlier, done several hundred calls with people who are wrestling with doubts. Of those several hundred, I would say one of them I didn't think was sincere.
Really?
And that surprises me.
That's encouraging.
Yeah. So sometimes when I ask people to be on the team, they ask me, so how do I vet people to see if they are actually sincere or if they're just wanting a debate? But I've never, to this point, needed to do that because it's only been the sincere people that have been contacting me. That's just my experience so far. So
now, why do you think that is?
I don't know. I actually don't know why that's the case.
Maybe the people who, I mean, I'm just speculating here myself. The fact that they're making the effort, that they have to make the effort means they are sincere. I don't know. I was curious in even our discussion today, we're kind of highlighting, skepticism and things like that. But what about those who are struggling with perhaps Eastern religions, mysticism? Do you have people who are wrestling with those questions can talk with as well?
Yeah, I sometimes get people that are interested in converting to Islam. Not very commonly, but it does happen. But yeah, Eastern religions, I don't think has come up at this point. It's mostly people considering becoming atheists or at least deconverting from Christianity. Very, very occasionally people considering converting to Islam or something along those lines.
I have one more follow-up, and this is just, I sometimes wonder about how someone's moral life can affect their spiritual vision, so to speak. And that is to say, do you find it the case that people may struggle with doubt because of immorality in their life or their own struggles to live up to an expectation that I have to live a certain holy way or something like that, and that would lead them towards doubt, like, I can't live the Christian life. Maybe it's not true,
Yeah, that certainly does factor in. I have been surprised by the number of people in these calls that confided that they've been struggling with pornography or some other sort of sexual addiction. Now, I'm not sure whether I can draw from that there's a strong correlation between doubting and pornography, or whether it's just a byproduct of the fact that most people are struggling in one way or another with pornography or sexual addiction. It's a very, very common problem in the world. But certainly, I think that that sort of thing or other forms of immorality can factor into a deconversion process, because it creates a cognitive dissonance where the brain tries to correct for this inconsistency between the beliefs and the actions. And so to correct that cognitive dissonance, you either want to discard the activity or you want to discard the belief. And so I think that can be a factor in a deconversion journey, sure. But I don't want to be simplistic. I think, unfortunately, a lot of Christians have a tendency to be a little simplistic in this area and say that the only reason that someone would deconvert is because they just want to have sex, or they just want to,
right,
or something along those lines. No, I think that it's a very diverse group of people, and there's very diverse reasons. And I think that people, and I say this having talked to hundreds and hundreds of people and watched perhaps thousands of YouTube videos of people deconverting, that there are people that sincerely believe that Christianity cannot be sufficiently justified by evidence, or that there is evidence that sufficiently justifies disbelief in Christianity. And I disagree with that conclusion, but I think there are people that sincerely hold that view.
Yeah, and I think I'm so glad you said that there are diverse reasons and that it's not a one size fits all. I think what you show is the evidence of somebody who has talked to hundreds of people. Versus, I think the person who says, oh, it's always for moral reasons, they've probably not talked to hundreds of people, right? I wanted to ask you, I had not planned on asking you this, but I'm going to go ahead because just after listening to you, I would be interested to hear how you would answer it. I have a really good friend who I've been sharing Christ with for over 10 years. We've talked about arguments and evidence. He's read a few books that I've given him. And he came to a place in that process where he basically admitted, I think there are really good arguments. I think there's really good evidence, and I really don't have any refutations or rebuttals, that are meaningful. But there are just some things in my life that I don't want to give up. Those were his exact words. They're like burned in my brain. What if you were on a call? And, you had invested in somebody and had numerous conversations, and then that's kind of where they came down. I'm curious where you would go from there.
Yeah, I mean, it reminds me a little bit of the incident in Mark 10 with the rich man that comes to Jesus saying, "Good teacher, what must I do to inherit eternal life?" And he says, "Well, you know the commandments, do not commit adultery, don't steal, and so forth." And he says, "Well, all these I've kept since my youth." And he said, Jesus says, "Well, you still lack one thing. Sell everything you have and give the money to the poor, and then you'll have treasure in heaven, and come follow me." And at this point, the man's face falls because he's a man of great wealth, and Jesus has put his finger on the commandment that he hasn't followed, which is idolatry. Right? He was an idolater, and he valued his great wealth more than he valued being a follower of Jesus. And Christianity is not merely an intellectual proposition, right? It's at least that, but it's a lot more than that. It does involve sacrifice. It does involve picking up your cross and following Christ. It does involve saying no to certain things that you would desire for. And so if someone is not willing to make that sacrifice, I think we have to be upfront about what Christianity requires of people, right? We shouldn't draw people into the kingdom and then 5 years down the line say, "Oh, by the way, did we mention?" No, we have to tell them, give them the full package, right? And I really try to do that. I try to inform people fully about what they're getting themselves into. I try to inform people about the evidence, both pro and con, because I want people to evaluate the evidence holistically. I want people to make an informed decision about whether to be Christians, and not just presenting the evidence pro and con, but also telling them, okay, what sacrifices they might have to make as a Christian, right? Especially someone that is in a Muslim background, for example, and might have to give up family, or might be rejected by their family if they convert to Christianity. We have to inform them of that.
Well, that's really good. Well, Jonathan, our time's coming to a close, and I just really want to thank you for joining us. I feel like we could keep talking about this for some time, but I'm praying that all goes well and profitably with this website, talkaboutdoubts.com. Those who are listening, I want to direct them to that. They can find links to Jonathan's resources in the show notes as well. And hope to have you on again sometime and catch up a little bit more, Jonathan.
Thank you so much. It's been a blast being on here, and I hope you have a great Christmas and New Year.
Thanks for listening to the podcast. If you have a question you'd like us to address or just a message for us, feedback, good or bad, you can either email us at podcast@apologetics315.com or leave a voice message for us using SpeakPipe. Just go to speakpipe.com/apologetics315 to leave us a message. And remember, if you include a Ghostbusters quote in your question, we guarantee that we'll read it on the podcast, and we also ensure up to 50% better quality answers. Also, if you've enjoyed today's podcast, please leave a review in iTunes or the podcast platform of your choice, and please share this episode with a friend if you found it useful. Remember, you can find lots of apologetics resources at apologetics315.com, along with show notes for today's episode. Find Chad's apologetic stuff over at Truthbomb Apologetics. That's truthbomb.blogspot.com. This has been Brian Oughton and Chad Gross for the Apologetics 315 podcast, and thanks for listening.
To show you how easy it is to file a claim with Geico, we hired a nature show host.
In the native habitat of a suburban driveway, the poor victim of a broken windshield is left assessing his vehicle, utterly helpless.
Well, not true. If he's got Geico, he can file a claim online, over the phone, or with his handy mobile app.
But like a lone gazelle, he'll suddenly be left to fend for himself, awaiting his terrible fate.
Nope. Geico will assign him a designated claims team to help him out too.
So the gazelle gets his car fixed and everything. Wow, nature is so cool.
Geico. Great service without all the drama.
If dog people made dog food, it wouldn't be sold in a 50-pound bag in the hardware aisle by the shoe polish. It would actually be food. It would be made with real, fresh meat and veggies gently cooked to preserve their nutritional value. You know, like food. The Farmer's Dog was created by dog people who cook and deliver fresh, healthy food. Try the Farmer's Dog and get fresh, pre-portioned meals tailored to your dog's needs. Tell us about your dog, build your plan, and get 50% off at thefarmersdog.com/listen. That's thefarmersdog.com/listen.